Hi, my name is Deborah R. Richardson of Debra R. Richardson LLC, and I work with you to help you clean up your vendor data, clean up your vendor processes so that you can pay the right vendor. Now, this week's Vendor Master File tip of the week is why you should collect the contract for your vendors, and then once you've collected it, what do you do with it? So let's start by seeing what three pieces of data I consider to be useful on that contract. And the first piece of data is the tax ID. So you want to verify that the tax ID that you have collected from the IRS W-9 matches the tax ID that is on the contract. And this comes in very as a very helpful piece of information, especially if the IRS 10 match is unsuccessful. You can see if there's just been a typo on the tax ID. Also, you can verify that you're just collecting the right IRS W-9. I mean, I used to work for a company that had hundreds of entities, and therefore they had hundreds of legal name tax ID combinations, hundreds of W-9s that could be submitted, and maybe you've received, or the person at your vendor's place of business has sent you the wrong legal entity that has contracted with your company. So you can use that to validate the tax ID. And then the second piece of information it can have on it is the remit address. So lots of times we get an IRS W-9 that has a mailing address or a tax address, and typically you would ask for an invoice or some other documentation if there is a separate remit address. You don't always get it. Sometimes you don't get that remit address until the invoice comes in, and then you have to stop and go through the existing vendor update process. Better to be proactive and try to add all the remit addresses as possible. And you can do that by checking the contract, because typically the contracts will include remit addresses as well. And then lastly, the payment terms. Now, I know in vendor setup, we may not be as concerned with payment terms as we need to be, but as you know, once we set up the vendor and once the invoice is posted, now you have to pay them. And you want to make sure to pay the vendor based on their negotiated payment terms. You don't want to pay them too early. You definitely don't want to pay them too late. You want to pay them based on their negotiated payment terms. And in order to do that, you do need to have the contract. And you do need to have, I do recommend you have the contract as support for those payment terms. And we'll see why in a minute. And so now that you know the useful information on the contract, I have these three things. Maybe you have more depending on your company. But let's go and see what to do with that contract now that you have it to use for the vendor record validations. So you may have already assumed or guessed that I was going to include this first one, but save it. Attach it to the vendor record, or if your accounting system or ERP doesn't allow you to attach documents, and save it wherever you save your vendor supporting documents. And if you don't currently have one, I do suggest that you start and create a secure space or directory or repository so that you can save the supporting documentation that you use to add vendors and that you use to change existing vendors. So save that contract. And then the next thing is to document the expiration date. So these contracts may have an expiration date on it. They may be evergreen though, but if they do have an expiration date, you do want to document that so that you can reach out to the applicable department and get the updated expiration date. And why do you want to do that? Because you want to make sure that as you're collecting these renewed contracts that you review those contracts or review that contract to make sure that no information has changed. And if it has changed, you want to make sure that you get it updated. And I talked before about payment terms. Payment terms are pieces of data or information that can change at the renewals. And so if, for example, your vendor goes from a payment due of net 60 to payment due of net 30, you definitely want to capture that. And that is really some information, especially in larger companies when you have, contracts being handled by different departments that doesn't always make it to AP. So you want to make sure that you get that contract when you're setting the vendor up, set them up with the right payment terms, validate other information against the information that you received on the W-9 or other documents, and then document the expiration date and reach out to the applicable department to make sure you get that updated contract so you can revalidate that vendor and then update any changes to the payment terms. All right, so that was it. I hope you enjoyed this Vendor Master File tip of the week. If you would like more information on how to improve your vendor process, please go to my website at debrarrichardson.com, where you'll find free tools and resources to avoid fraud, regulatory fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So good luck, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be notified next Tuesday for the next Vendor Master File tip of the week.